completely reading from scratch though, so it should be a little different than that, at least conceptually. I don't think so. I think no, they're pretty much the same. They are pretty similar though. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Here we go. Hey Charles. Biological prediction. So basically, we've been talking about a lot about backprop, and for backprop, you can just compute what it's supposed to be. You can take what you're supposed to get, and then compute how to update things to make the next computation closer to what it was supposed to be. Okay. The brain doesn't have what it was like. There's no way to send every neuron what it was supposed to be, right? Maybe. So that's one problem. And then the other is that we don't have, so backpropagation, if we were to take it in a biological sense, would imply that every neuron that computes something in a forward pass, so like you receive sensory input, is also going to have a neuron that goes the other way, like a reciprocal neuron, in order to send back some signal of error, right? But that doesn't exist. It's not like every neuron in the brain has two complete pairs. So we're at this like crux of how do we know that the brain is making predictions and then computing an error somehow, because that's how you learn. But how the hell is it doing that? Okay, so first, we're going to talk about the structure of the neocortex so that we can all be on the same page. Then we'll talk about learning criteria, which sounds like I'm outlining a course syllabus, which I'm not. I'm talking about like what do you need in order to learn. And then third is how that might happen using dendrites. And then fourth is maybe how we could apply this to coding ideas. Okay, so this is the paper that I am basing this off of. Pretty cool stuff from Jeff Hawkins, who is like a neuroscientist guy. Cool. Okay, so, or I guess I should say just like structure of the brain, but the brain has what we think of, so emotions and stuff like that are pretty like hard coded in the brain and driven by smaller like independent modules. So those are not going to be the focus. That's mostly like in the limbic brain, or like maybe the cerebellum does movement and stuff like that. Whereas the neocortex is like the wrinkly part, and it wraps around the whole rest of it. And people generally say that that is responsible for like higher order thinking. Importantly, the neocortex is composed of many different little columns of neurons. So each column has thousands of neurons in it. And so the columns are going to run like basically like the brain is like this, right? This is like a cross section. Spinal cord, right? You just cut the brain, right? And the columns are going like this. Okay, and then on top of that, within each column, there's 6 layers. So I'll show you a picture of that. Okay, so yeah, that's a picture of the layers within each column. Yeah, there's a cross section. So that's what I was talking about. And what each layer does, I don't know. People have some ideas. It's kind of mysterious, but it's interesting because some of the neurons within a layer connect very, like, they skip over the other layer, connect all the way to the top, or some of them are just like to the next layer. And then within each column, there are mini columns. So that's just like a subunit of a column. I don't know, whatever. There's different subunits within these things. But it's interesting because of this, like, this structure is found everywhere in the neocortex. So what Hawkins claims is because this is everywhere in the neocortex, and the neocortex is doing all of the basically higher level thinking, that there has to be some general algorithm that is being run in order to learn basically anything, since almost all of our learning is done in the neocortex. So that's an interesting point. And I keep going back. Sorry. Okay. Nope. Okay. So then the neocortex has pyramidal neurons. We talked about that a little bit before. And pyramidal neurons, some people say that differently, but I think it's the same thing. So then each neuron has dendrites. Dendrites receive input from other neurons, and it has thousands of them. And the question is, why? Because when you get out to here, like very far away from the body of the neuron, the inputs no longer are strong enough to trigger an action potential in general. So those are called basal dendrites. And then very close to the neuron body, the cell body, is going to be the proximal dendrites. And those are the ones that are primarily responsible for action potentials. And then you can also classify a third like distance away, which is called apical, which are like the really far ones, and you might say that those are responsible for something else as well. But for our purposes, you could lump the apical dendrites in with the basal dendrites. Like basically, they're too far to cause an action potential. So why are they there? Why are we making this connection? And then, so on each of these are like dendritic branches. There's going to be like thousands of synapses, which are connections. Well, maybe not that many. There's going to be a lot of synapses on each dendritic branch that connect to other neurons. Okay, so I kind of already covered this in the beginning, but basically when you learn, there's like an input, you make a prediction, you get the next input, and then you adjust and see like, was that right, was that wrong? And then there's the idea that when you're wrong, you adjust a lot more than when you're right. So in the brain, we can't have anything that's saying like, this is the ground truth and then propagating that everywhere, because we don't have any mechanism to do that. So that's what local learning really means. Continuous learning, so you can't just like train in one environment, get really good at that, and then expect that to never change, because in the real world, the dynamics of your environment are changing. You have to be able to continually apply what you learn to different environments, and you can't just like separate train from test, and like we do sometimes in machine learning. So yeah, it also incorporates like prior experience in the brain. And then another interesting thing is we can make multiple simultaneous predictions about what you think is going to happen, without necessarily being conscious of all those predictions that you're making. And then you also want something that's robust to noise, like there, as Charles has pointed out, there aren't, and maybe I'm not sure if he said this, but somebody has said this, like there aren't as many like adversarial examples for humans. Like a pixel doesn't change and then we confuse a cat with a dragon or something. That doesn't happen to us so much. Okay, then also this is a really cool bridge in Portland, because that was a lot of information, and I thought this picture was cool. Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to answer all these questions posed with the theory about how dendrites can like sort of solve this, and so we're going to do that by sort of like constructing a scenario, right? Okay, so you're in your room, and then you hear like the key to your apartment going to lock, right? So maybe unconsciously, maybe you're like in the middle of making this presentation, perhaps, and you hear this. So you don't actually think like, oh, I think the door is now going to open. But your brain is predicting that because you've heard this noise before. So either the door opens and you're like, okay, cool. Or maybe that never even becomes conscious and you never look up from your computer. Or the door does not open and maybe now you're like confused. You're like, what's happening? Okay. So in either of these cases, you're not like controlling what sensory, this is just like a subtle detail. You're not controlling like what sensory input you're getting. So your conscious is not like saying, stop hearing things or start hearing things that you expected or didn't expect. Like, no, you're always hearing things. It's just whether or not you're attending to them. So your brain has some mechanism to deal with that. Okay, so here's what's happening. Hypothetically, you hear the key turn. So that's gonna cause the activation of all the neurons that are directly wired to like your ears, right? So that is what hearing that is, right? It's those neurons firing that connect to your ears and are associated with key turning sound like wavelengths. Okay, so that's the feed forward pass. Now, these neurons that are firing connect to other neurons, and maybe they connect to neurons that encode the sound of the door opening. Okay, but the neurons that encode the sound of the door opening are not firing, because if they were, you would be hallucinating if the door is open. You would be hearing, but it's not happening. So that's not what's happening, but they maybe connect to it. So then what happens is they connect to the basal dendrites, if you remember those. They connect to the dendrites that are far away from the cell body of the ones that encode the sound of the door open. Okay. And what that does is it doesn't cause them to fire, but it does depolarize them. So if you know a little bit about biology, then you know that depolarizing a neuron is going to make it easier for that neuron to fire later. So what we've done is we've encoded a prediction by making it easier for the neurons that we predict are going to fire. Okay. When it does receive an input that it expects. So then what's going to happen, right, is we hear the door open. So now the neurons now the neurons that encode the door opening, the noise of the door opening, are going to fire because of the feed forward input. And they would have fired either way. You're going to hear the door open either way. But in the case where we predicted that they're going to fire, they're going to fire faster because they were depolarized. And when they fire faster, this inhibits the neurons around it. Okay. I think. I mean, I don't know. So that's at least the theory. I'm not sure if the local inhibition is a known biological mechanism or not. But for this theory to work, it has to happen. So that inhibits the neurons around it from firing. So the ones that were predicted are going to fire faster, and then they're going to inhibit things. And in this way, we're going to learn the things that we do not expect more than the things that we do expect, because the things we do expect, fewer neurons fired and they fire faster. So fewer neurons firing means less heavy input. It's like fire together, wire together, that's heavy learning. So fewer things are firing because of the inhibition when we predict things. So that leads to a couple things. A, events that are predicted are sparser in the brain. So that's very useful, and we'll see why. And then B, I don't know what the B thing was. I was going to say something, but forgot it. So whatever. I think wait, so I'm going to pause. Any questions? You good? Okay. I might have already talked about all of this. Okay, yeah, so more neurons fire when the prediction is not met. Fewer neurons fire when the prediction is met. And so here's why that matters. I think I have a slide on that. So if we're basing predictions on inputs to the basal dendrites, we need to encode the predictions with very few neurons in order to represent all the things we need to predict in the brain. So if it took like 100 neurons to recognize one pattern, and that was like predicting that the door is going to open, that's too many. Like we can't, your brain would not be big enough to be able to predict all the things. And you would, moreover, you would be able to easily confuse that prediction with many other predictions because, so I think my example is a better way to phrase this. Like, if I have 1,000 Skittles total, and I can arrange them, like maybe you have a grid of them, and I can arrange them in patterns on the grid. But in one case, I have to arrange 999 of them to make a pattern. And in the other case, I have to arrange 10 or 1 of them. I can make way more patterns if I can just arrange one at a time than if I have to arrange a bunch of them. So basically, if you have more patterns that you can represent, this is like an extremely useful property in the brain. So that's why sparsity is really important. And that's why you have to have this local inhibition when a neuron fires up as expected. And if you've taken through 12, maybe you could work out some math about this. It's actually in the paper. They did all the math in the paper. Okay, so this is pretty much it. Wow, that was a lot. Really fast. So then the paper, they like simulated these neurons. And like every other paper that's ever simulated like anything, they say that theirs is the best way to do it. And, like, it beats all the benchmarks and whatever. But I don't know, there's probably some heavy caveats to what it can do or cannot do. One of the things the paper says is it's like very good at learning sequences rather than focusing on just predictions in general. So what they tested it on was a database of just like strings, and then they would give it to like ABC and then make it predict what the next input is going to be. So if that was B, then yeah. So that was their database that they used to make this model. And then they said that it is better than like maybe pop field networks or whatever for learning sequences. So that was kind of interesting. I just think there are maybe some ways that we could incorporate like depolarizing or making neurons fire faster or like more frequently or inhibit other neurons in like a neural network when the prediction is as expected. Yeah, so any questions, thoughts? That's pretty much it. Yeah, I think the other thing about sparsity is like what we're doing, and I don't know if this is actually what we do in practice, but what we're doing in machine learning right now is instead of making it like one sort of way to make it sparse is regularization, but it doesn't actually make the sparse neurons 0, it just decays at rates, so you're still doing the same amount of computation. So it kind of ends up working better, but I think it would work better if it would work faster if you could actually just not do the computations that you don't want to do.
The case of which it's
it just like all of them.
so the activation or
The activation of what?
the feature or the
Both.
Yeah. How does that impose sparsity?
What?
How does decaying the activation impose sparsity?
So it's not, so it's like, it just makes the weights less. So it makes any given weight have less impact on the model. So it's not really the same, but it's similar. And if you keep going to the point where some of them are like, some of the weights will get so low that they're almost good. Then it's like some place, but they're still doing the computation, so it's like, why?
It's similar to like it's similar to coding.
Sort of, I think doing is probably better out. I think what we're doing in machine learning is like going over the basics like the naive attempts and great, not really sure why.
You have a really, really big network. You put down all the extra weights off of it, have a very sparse set of features.
I'm understanding. If basically the between all the weights in between training, like the back propagation can be more. Some of them will.
None of them go down to zero, but then I get.
They get. The problem with that is even with weights, zero weights.
Yeah, in von Neumann it does, but not in normal. Sparse. It's true neurons.
So like people even when it's zero, it doesn't people go do that computation and
So there's actually ways to have very efficient sparse matrix with stuff, I guess, that you can do on GPUs, but it requires like having certain algorithms. Yeah, but there's two ways you have to do all the implications and just have a bunch of zeros and just throw it in there, or you can actually go through and only apply to the features.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Do you guys know of any way that people like? So basically, like, as a feed forward pass goes through, like things that it connects to, but maybe doesn't activate.
So there is something called division, which I'll look at a little bit, just some which does sparse coding, and also it does local competition.
Oh yeah. So how?
Through the same L0 thing I was telling you about before. It solves the anti-hard problem of finding the best feature set, which is the fewest number of features, so the lowest L0 norm and the best representation. And in doing so, it computes two features that are like, which one's best fit for data, and it picks the best one. But yeah, it's supposed to be more biologically limited, but it isn't quite spiky. It's called pedivision. Actually, it was built by a scientist who went to Europe for the graduate degree in neuroscience.
Wait, okay, how do I spell it?
Yeah, actually, what this last time. But yes. I can't really explain it to you, but I think you will know.
Okay.
More like an act. So it's
Sweet. That's pretty sweet. Yeah, so like when something propagates through a neural network, like it always activates basically the next neuron. Unless it's like sparse coding, in which it's like zero. Well,
it's not like that, but it's kind of like that. Like you have to solve and this is it's kind of like like solve it. It's really hard to find the big part starts you just say
you know why?
I'm sorry. I just know that it takes forever to find those sparse representations. I was sparse coding pathology slides. It's like no local minutes. Use one layer. That's sparse coding.
Yeah, I feel like that's, I don't know, I feel like that's kind of weird. It's like the neural networks, every time you propagate something through, it always activates the things it's connected to. Whereas in the brain, it's like maybe it will fire, maybe it won't.
Yeah, no, I asked the exact same question. I think to the guy who created that software, and he put that answer. Yeah, Because depending on the also be you could have active function that takes it also. So like maybe like almost like a restricted value kind of deal, right? Where it would be like value 1, 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing. But then that's like prediction or something like that, right? And then you have if you don't need to prime, you just need to
Then you can make something. So that's what they did. They made something similar to that. I wish I brought my copy. Yeah. So you could like make something like that. But I find that interesting because maybe you could just encode the location of which neuron is firing, and then this is also interesting because like transformer models, the main thing that they do is they encode the location of the word in a sentence, as well as well, then they pass it through a like network that will decide what. Yeah, so that's what they do. I'm trying. Anyway, but the main thing is like they started to encode the positional location of each word instead of encoding instead of using recurrence. So I don't know, maybe you could encode the location just like what neuron is firing as while you pass on the value to the next.
Assuming everything connected every time. It's not like, say, for example, you pulse something through once and then this two separate each running and the expectation what happened. It's almost like what happened previously is saved somewhere in the network of the current network in some way, in the sense that what you passed to before lingers in the network. In that sense, but it would be something different. It would almost be like the first pass through the network, forward pass adjust the weights instead of something else. So like it would somehow say, hey, here's something. Usually when this something comes, you expect this thing, so let's just up these weights and result in this final weight. But if the input is different enough, then it will cause enough it's a time also.
So wait, how are you? You said if the input is different enough, how are you getting that?
No, I'm trying to explain it. So in the brain, there is there was the input of the sound and there's the expected input of the sound of the world. Right? So clearly if the sound of the key wasn't there, the prediction for the world wasn't there. Therefore, when the prediction for the sound of the key was, or just the sound of the key was put through the brain network, it changed something about how that network is going to respond to that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what should happen if you were modeling the brain.
I'm wondering, like, I'm not very well versed in the current neural networks, but like, how would one input influence the next one? If I put something in one, what changes that network?
Well, if you backplot after that input, then it's all the weights to try to fit to make that the error that you observe from that input less, but that doesn't necessarily like.
But if that changes, that is an adjustment for that input. I'm talking about adjusting to the next
Right. Exactly. So
So
that doesn't really happen.
yeah, but in return, something similar. I don't know. What has changed per pass? And it's something to do with like new passes. There's moving on language function, right? So to pass a word like spaghetti, somehow it would pick the word meatballs after, or the prime for the word meatballs. So that's what's good. So that something like that, you would expect to say
So the current neural networks. A second. It's like you take a word and then try to predict the next word, and then take the word and the next word, and then you try to predict the next word. So you keep adding what you've already seen. Maybe Diego, you feel some of that.
Any word can affect any of let's say earlier on you have some word and for recurrent neural network, if let's say it's to realize that actually has something and so it's to do something else now, it wants to get the weights all actually there. They go through that and see the word all the way back. Whereas with transformers, they essentially create a every word and every word. And they just kind of further the path. In the shortest path, so they do it at the same time. If that makes sense, that was a very important explanation.
Yeah, I think they have kind of an idea of what you're saying.
Yeah.
So if we had a sentence and we used an RNA to, try and encode that sentence,
Yeah,
then
let's
to change the representation of the first word, or representation of the first word, which like go back over through several recurrent layers, which is easier just to change the weights in the first recurrent layer in some way, rather than changing the sentence.
Let's say so we have this sentence. Let's pretend for a moment we could say that our model doesn't do very complete, takes a sentence that says, is this a realistic sentence or not? So in this case, I'm not sure, depends on whether you consider semantically or grammatically. The realistic, let's say it's grammatically realistic. So this is a good sentence. So this would be a critical one. So it's for words, or probably embedded in vectors, whatever. So for the case of the recurrent network, we would have our recurrent cell and yeah, it's better than that. It is, but still. So we go for a recurrent cell and that's it is the same cell. We're called over and over. But ultimately, we end up with a output of some representation of some representation of our sentence, which we then feed into something else and say there's something to it. What would you do with a transforming network instead? I don't really know the structure of that. But what I've seen, and let's just consider it. What I can talk about is why they're hard in time. It's hard to really talk about like transformers to a certain level. What the transformer does, like, let's say it says 0 and it should say 1. So the gradient can have to go. If you're real, and here's the kind of okay, something about this, it's going to be easier. That doesn't make sense. The error is in this area, and if it says 0, or if it says 1, it's good, but it shouldn't say 0 is bad. Like some gradients related to this area, like some weights related to this area. And for that, you can go through here. Something to do with this, this go all the way back to these areas, through everything. And that operator is just lost. The information takes too much time to travel. But if we just assume that this is a very stuff way of thinking about it, the information kind of gets muddled up by everything else. This is a very terrible, not based on anything. But it's just like it's really hard to get information passed through places. if we don't specifically make something that makes it easy, that's makes it easy for information to transfer through. But the algorithms of layers, you end up with the same problem. But a transformer, I don't actually remember anything, but it just kind of takes everything and spits out everything. And it just has some kind of way of relating everything to everything. Okay, so like if we have our matrix or whatever, and we end up with some kind of notion of like dog tends to add someone else, this, and we end up finding that some combination of those dimensions with very valid and wasn't that, and we find we end up we still get that same problem where this is the problematic area. We can just take that like connection between them and directly take out directly operate on that somehow. I don't know. But somehow just don't have to deal with the same garbage. Okay, that's good enough. That was what I was trying to say earlier. I just wanted to make it super clear. Does that sound about right? Yeah. Okay. Good.
Something like, I do remember that we were transformers that they highlighted the fact that
wasn't involved.
Yeah, that's the whole bit. That's like the thing is that is the key differentiator. So, yeah, if you guys do look into it.
I literally learned how to transformers last night. Like, well, I can't explain it to you now, so.
I'm pretty sure you know this. Like, honestly, that's just only the event times again.
It's like the architecture of a transformer network is so unintuitive. Like I can describe it, but I don't know why it works. Like it's you have the encoder, and then it goes through a self-attention mechanism, and then it goes through a like an add and norm. What is add and norm? Who knows? I don't know. And then it spits out something, and then it gives that to the decoder, but then you can only use half the confusion matrix, and then it goes through another self-attention mechanism, and another add and norm, and then some feed-forward networks, and then it spits out an answer. And it's like, what is happening? I don't know, but that's the architecture.
I heard someone describe it as
Stuff like that.
so I've heard it described as essentially it's like it's sort of like theories that theories about it's sort of like the theories, you know, like the essential matrix, it's sort of used to like solve like I mean like they have to not so just that it's essentially that I think it's really important to understand that what the these value pairs are and talk about it. I don't know what they are, but at some point I don't know.
Maybe that's another. Maybe that's a feature from transform.
Honestly, let's do that. That was fun. No, I had a paper I want to talk about. I want to talk about the information stuff. This is going to be fun. But I feel like if you work with really like you do this and something for I and then let's see
Okay, so in general, if any, so what I'm interested in, like in terms of this paper and how the brain predicts things, is like if anybody sees networks that apply like local learning rules instead of like backprop, that's kind of interesting. Or yeah, just things that maybe make certain neurons activate like when they're expected to activate instead of just activating everything always.
Right? So when you have it, it doesn't make sense to have it to
Yeah.
Is activates at some rate that's supposed to go from baseline rate. So the never activating, or two would be activating one would be activating at some sort of. But it makes no networks or has a brain.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing we can take from this, it's pretty surface level, is just like the brain has a lot of connectivity, but not, it's very sparse because then you can get a lot more patterns out of it. Activating everything for every pattern, and it just computes all the time. can't tell the difference between like a table and a chair because they're the same pattern. This says that the networks that they made are better than Hopfield networks. So if you guys want to dig into that. Yeah. Yeah, the simulation, it's a pretty readable paper.
There's essentially Hopfield networks for allowing users non-restricted to
Also, side note, Hopfield networks, if you bring those up next journal club, Stephen Grossberg might get a little annoyed because he thinks that they should be called Grossberg networks.
What's the reason always called networks? For a class, like I wrote with a small report on those networks, right? That's the Hopfield networks. Right, yes.
Okay, so I also actually have bonus slides.
We actually didn't know.
These are my dogs. I'm my
Not your
one of them, yeah, it's not this one though, the one behind me. That's two. I love that I get the sound. And then I also have chips. If anybody wants them. Not as good as pizza. Got lots of flavors. So this. I give you guys. Maybe that's all I got. So. And then this is another photo of Portland, very pretty. Wow. This is the fall. That's somebody totally photoshopped that to make it look nicer than it is. At least the colors. Okay, bonus slides. I'm going to give you my very elementary understanding of adaptive resonance theory, which is, yeah, so this is great. But I haven't read this book, so I can't really speak to it. Yeah, okay, yeah. Book. Buy it on Amazon. Click the link in the description below. 20% off. Oh, let me say.
We want it to all show up like whenever we're talking about something, like every single person just have the book and just pull it out. Somebody asks a question. It's like, oh yeah, I'll just pay something.
Actually, I have the book that got this paper in my backpack.
What if like Grossberg to 17?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I think that's like this.
now that we're doing just like book show. Yeah, because it gets fucking bent and all that. But okay, adaptive resonance theory is a different idea about making predictions in the brain. I don't know if it's mutually exclusive with the theory that I just presented because I don't know enough about it to say, but basically the idea is that you get, so when people say bottom up signals in the brain, they mean like that's sensory input. And when they say top down, they mean that's like input from your neocortex. So you're thinking and then it's sending signals to something else. So the idea is that bottom up inputs match when they match with a top down expectation of like your neocortex, and you don't necessarily need to be conscious of what you're expecting. But when that matches, they get into like this resonance state in that there's just like a lot of excitatory neurons like going around in a circle. And so this is like a resonance state, and this is what you're conscious of, apparently, according to the theory. So This is a very interesting theory. Definitely read more about it before Monday, because then we can ask all the questions we want to Stephen Grossberg. Yep, these cycles are called resonance states, and then nope. So that's all I have about adaptive resonance theory. I wish I could explain. I like 5.
Well, because the group of the room, I'd like to look more before probably.
Are you talking?
Or how much we want to, or I thought you were trying to.
I would prefer like you all to try to talk to me.
I know that's like who actually wants to.
Yeah. I might want to. So it's kind of a video. It's in Boston.
Yeah. You didn't come out to fly outside?
I know. Come on. I too journal club. It's like speaking of nerds.
Are you going to all of those in one group? Or like, I don't know if it's pretty nice to be in one group. If you can find a one with the TV.
I was gonna be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Record it.
Yeah. I know. I was thinking about promoting it to the public, but I don't want to have the public like come in here because this room is very small. So it would be like if other people want to attend, they could attend on Zoom maybe. But not ask him any questions probably, just because that's too hard to deal with, and I don't want them to ask questions if they haven't really like prepared much. But what do you guys think about that?
It would be cool, like, to go to club with the, but I feel like smaller stuff.
Just say you report it.
You could also turn it into a seminar type of thing, drop in and chat box.
Yeah.
Like that. I don't know how to set it up, but that could work. And then you can just watch that and like, if they buy it and like.
Well, he doesn't have a presentation. I don't think.
He's gonna come talk to it,
Yeah.
just he shows up and like he asks him questions.
Yeah, so we gotta actually know what we're talking about. My
He sent us videos and he expects us to watch it before we actually attend. I can send it, but like even if we have a hard time understanding it.
yeah, the
See
videos.
some clips of it.
First of all, his slides like give me an aneurysm. Like there's so many colors, but I don't think the colors mean anything. So it's like what?
Did you send all the videos that you put up with good? Did you already send the videos? I don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can send it.
So I think the video he sent us to watch, I didn't like, but I think you sent one that's more recent that I think is better. More
That's okay,
understandable.
because I didn't even send. So
Okay, we'll resend a lot of stuff. So the other thing that's interesting about this is that this does translate into software, the theory of like adaptive resonance, and it's not machine learning. Well, I mean, you could call it like an unsupervised learning algorithm, and they also have like semi-supervised variants. But these things are used in industry for interesting things. So I think somebody used it to help design like the Boeing 747 or whatever, or maybe not that one.
And that follows this guy.
Hopefully not that one, but I don't know. Yeah, they're using it for some interesting things in real life. So it's not just a theory of the brain, but it's also useful software.
Is it neuroscience?
Yeah. So it came as a way to describe phenomena. So yeah, that is actually all that I